David Boies is among those whose work helped Harvey Weinstein try to conceal his abusive behavior. Full photo by J. Janner. The stories of UAL abuse swirling around the producer Harvey Weinstein offer so much not to like that it is hard to imagine much more to say about men behaving badly. But it turns out there is more. One of the nation's most respected lawyers, David Boies, is among those whose work helped Mr. Weinstein try to conceal his abusive behavior. Mr. Boies personally signed a contract with a private investigation organization, Black Cube, to unearth, as the contract specified, intelligence which will help the client's efforts to completely stop the publication of a new negative article in a leading NY newspaper. The client was Mr. Weinstein. The contract also authorized investigators to look for material to discredit harmful negative information about Mr. Weinstein in a forthcoming book. Having Mr. Boies rather than Mr. Weinstein sign the contract had the advantage of protecting the resulting information under the attorney-client privilege, which would shield it from disclosure in subsequent disputes. What makes the involvement of Mr. Boies so egregious is not only that it helped Mr. Weinstein conceal his abuse and undermine the First Amendment interests of the press and the public. It is also that Mr. Boies' representation posed a conflict of interest, because his firm, Boies Schiller Flexner, was representing the New York Times, the leading NY newspaper, in libel litigation at the same time. In an article in The New Yorker that exposed the firm's Black Cube contract, Mr. Boies denied that efforts to discredit the Times story reflected such a conflict. In his view, it was entirely appropriate to investigate precisely what Mr. Weinstein was accused of doing and to investigate whether there were facts that would rebut those accusations. And he added, if evidence could be uncovered to convince the Times the charges should not be published, I did not believe, and do not believe, that would be adverse to the Times' interests. But under bar ethical rules and accepted practices, the people who get to decide what is in the Times' interest are the leaders of the Times. A lawyer who represents them is prohibited from accepting other matters that would reasonably be considered adverse to their interests without their informed written consent. Mr. Boies responded in a public statement that his firm had a clause in its retainer agreement with the Times that purported to waive all conflicts of interest on matters unrelated to cases in which the newspaper had retained the firm. But as the Times leadership pointed out in its own statement, it never contemplated that the firm would contract with investigators to do opposition research on its own reporters. Unsurprisingly, the Times considered this conduct to be a grave betrayal of trust, and grounds to terminate the firm. It is hard to imagine how a lawyer of Mr. Boies' caliber would not have anticipated this reaction. It gets worse. Bar ethical rules prohibit lawyers not only from engaging in fraud, deceit or misrepresentation, but also from inducing others to do so. They also specifically forbid lawyers from directing non-lawyers to engage in prohibited conduct. Black Cube employees were in fact involved in such deceit. Investigators misrepresented their identities in order to gain confidences from women whom Mr. Weinstein had harassed or assaulted. Although Mr. Boies now claims that he had no knowledge of such practices, he surely was in a position to have such knowledge and had reason to suspect them. He had hired an organization known for hardball tactics and reportedly received reports of the findings. Even Mr. Boies himself acknowledges the problems that his relationship with Black Cube raised. He told The New Yorker, we should not have been contracting with and paying investigators that we did not select and direct. When asked about his representation of Mr. Weinstein generally, Mr. Boies told The New Yorker, I don't believe former lawyers should criticize former clients. But he then went on to do just that. Mr. Boies stated Mr. Weinstein has himself recognized that his contact with women was indefensible and incredibly hurtful. In retrospect, I knew enough in 2015 that I believe I should have been on notice of a problem and done something about it. Well, no argument there. And the time to attempt to dissuade Mr. Weinstein from persisting in newly abusive conduct and hiring investigators to hush it up was when that conduct was occurring. For Mr. Boies to condemn Mr. Weinstein's conduct now seems like throwing a former client under the bus in the hopes of salvaging his own reputation. But the public shaming compounds the misjudgment and shames Mr. Boies as well. Such moral myopia is particularly dispiriting when it involves leaders of the bar. Mr. Boies is a renowned litigator, a champion of same marriage and, according to his own statement, an attorney with a long history of protecting the rights of women. When leaders with such high visibility cut ethical corners, it sends a powerful and corrosive message. Already less than a fifth of Americans rate the honesty and integrity of lawyers as high or very high. The sort of conduct here is one reason why